The 1950s in America were marked by fear and suspicion. The Cold War with the Soviet Union created a climate of anxiety. Americans worried about communist infiltration and the threat of nuclear war. This fear was palpable in everyday life. Senator Joseph McCarthy fueled this fear. He made accusations of communist subversion within the government. This period, known as the Red Scare, had a profound impact on American society. It also laid the groundwork for another, often overlooked witch hunt, the Lavender Scare. The Lavender Scare emerged alongside the Red Scare, two dark chapters in American history that unfolded simultaneously. Both were fueled by fear and suspicion, creating an atmosphere of paranoia that permeated everyday life. The Red Scare targeted suspected communists, driven by the belief that they were infiltrating American institutions. The Lavender Scare, on the other hand, focused on homosexuals, who were seen as equally dangerous. Both groups were seen as threats to national security, a narrative that was perpetuated by the government and media. Both were subjected to intense scrutiny and persecution, often without any substantial evidence. The rationale behind targeting homosexuals was rooted in deep-seated prejudice and widespread misinformation. During this time, homosexuality was widely viewed as a mental illness, a belief that was supported by the medical community. It was also seen as a moral failing, condemned by religious and moral authorities. This stigma made it easy to portray homosexuals as susceptible to blackmail by communist agents, a convenient scapegoat for national anxieties. The government argued that homosexuals could be coerced into revealing state secrets, thus justifying their exclusion from federal employment and other positions of trust. Despite the oppressive climate, some brave individuals began to speak out against these injustices, laying the groundwork for future civil rights movements. These early activists faced immense challenges, but their efforts were crucial in challenging the discriminatory policies of the time. Over time, public attitudes began to shift, and the groundwork laid during the Lavender Scare era helped pave the way for greater acceptance and equality in the decades to come. The persecution of homosexuals during the Lavender Scare was largely driven by the perception that they posed a security risk. This period, marked by intense scrutiny and fear, saw the lives of many individuals upended due to their sexual orientation. This perception was rooted in a confluence of factors, including Cold War paranoia, prevailing social attitudes towards homosexuality, and unfounded fears about blackmail and espionage. The era was characterized by a heightened sense of vigilance against any perceived threats to national security. Firstly, the Cold War created an atmosphere of intense fear and suspicion. The geopolitical tension between the United States and the Soviet Union led to a pervasive sense of anxiety. Every citizen was encouraged to be on the lookout for potential threats, both external and internal. The United States and the Soviet Union were locked in an ideological battle, and the threat of communist infiltration was perceived as very real. This ideological clash was not just about military might, but also about winning the hearts and minds of people around the world. This fear fueled a climate of paranoia, where anyone perceived as different or subversive could become a target. The McCarthy hearings exemplified this, as countless individuals were accused of communist sympathies without substantial evidence. Secondly, homosexuality was widely stigmatized during this period. The societal norms of the 1950s were rigid, and any deviation from the traditional family structure was viewed with suspicion and disdain. It was considered a mental illness, a moral failing, and a threat to social order. Medical professionals of the time often subjected homosexuals to inhumane treatments in an attempt to cure them, reflecting the deep-seated prejudices of the era. This widespread homophobia made it easier for the government to portray homosexuals as inherently untrustworthy and susceptible to blackmail. The narrative was that their very existence posed a risk to national security. The government argued that homosexuals could be coerced into revealing state secrets to foreign agents in exchange for keeping their sexual orientation hidden. This argument was used to justify the dismissal and persecution of countless individuals. This argument, known as the security risk theory, was based on the assumption that homosexuals were inherently vulnerable to blackmail because they lived in fear of exposure and societal rejection. The theory ignored the fact that many homosexuals were just as patriotic and loyal as their heterosexual counterparts. However, there was no evidence to support the claim that homosexuals were more likely to be disloyal or susceptible to blackmail than heterosexuals. In fact, many experts and civil rights advocates of the time argued that the security risk theory was based on prejudice rather than fact. They pointed out that the real issue was the societal stigma and discrimination that forced homosexuals to live in fear. Over time, the Lavender Scare became a symbol of the broader struggle for LGBTQ+ rights. It highlighted the dangers of allowing fear and prejudice to dictate public policy. The persecution faced by homosexuals during this period served as a catalyst for future generations to fight for equality and justice. Today, the legacy of the Lavender Scare reminds us of the importance of vigilance against discrimination in all its forms. It serves as a stark reminder of the consequences of allowing unfounded fears to justify the persecution of marginalized groups. The fight for LGBTQ+ rights continues, inspired by the resilience and courage of those who came before. As we reflect on this dark chapter in history, it is crucial to remember the lessons learned and to continue advocating for a more inclusive and just society. The Lavender Scare may have been a product of its time, but its impact resonates to this day, reminding us of the ongoing struggle for human rights and dignity. The Lavender Scare had a devastating impact on the lives of countless individuals. This period of intense scrutiny and persecution targeted those suspected of being homosexual, leading to widespread fear and suffering. The persecution took many forms, from invasive investigations and interrogations to dismissals from government positions, often based on flimsy accusations or mere suspicion. Government officials were relentless in their pursuit, often using underhanded tactics to root out those they deemed undesirable. One of the most common consequences was the loss of employment. The fear of being outed led many to resign preemptively, while others were abruptly terminated without just cause. Thousands of government employees were fired or forced to resign because of their sexual orientation. This mass exodus from government positions not only disrupted lives but also deprived the government of talented and dedicated workers. These individuals often found it difficult, if not impossible, to find new jobs due to the stigma associated with homosexuality. The blacklisting extended beyond government jobs, affecting their prospects in the private sector as well. Their careers and livelihoods were shattered. Many faced financial ruin, unable to support themselves or their families. The emotional toll was equally devastating, as they grappled with the loss of their professional identities and the betrayal of their colleagues. The Scare also created a climate of fear and secrecy within the LGBTQ+ community. Social gatherings became fraught with anxiety, as individuals worried about being seen or reported. Many homosexuals lived in constant fear of being exposed and persecuted. This fear permeated every aspect of their lives, from their personal relationships to their professional interactions. They were forced to hide their true identities, living double lives and avoiding any public displays of affection or association with other homosexuals. The need for secrecy strained relationships and isolated individuals from their communities. This atmosphere of secrecy and fear had a profound psychological impact on many individuals. The constant vigilance and the need to conceal their true selves led to chronic stress and mental health issues. They experienced shame, isolation, and anxiety, living under the constant threat of exposure and persecution. The psychological scars of this period were deep and long-lasting, affecting their well-being for years to come. The Lavender Scare created a generation of closeted individuals, forced to live in the shadows of a society that rejected and condemned them. This shadow existence deprived them of the opportunity to live openly and authentically. The persecution also extended beyond the workplace. The reach of the Lavender Scare infiltrated their personal lives, making them targets of suspicion and surveillance. Individuals suspected of homosexuality were subjected to invasive surveillance, interrogations, and even forced psychiatric treatment. These measures were justified under the guise of national security, but they were, in reality, tools of oppression. Their personal lives were scrutinized, their homes were raided, and their reputations were tarnished. The Lavender Scare left a legacy of fear and mistrust, a dark chapter in the history of civil rights. Despite the oppressive climate, the Lavender Scare also galvanized the LGBTQ+ community. Activists began to organize, laying the groundwork for future movements that would fight for equality and justice. The courage and resilience of those who stood up against the persecution paved the way for the progress we see today. Their struggle reminds us of the importance of standing up against injustice, no matter the cost. The legacy of the Lavender Scare is a testament to the enduring spirit of the LGBTQ+ community. It serves as a reminder of the progress that has been made and the work that still needs to be done to ensure equality for all. As we reflect on this dark period, we honor the resilience of those who endured it and the ongoing fight for a world where everyone can live openly and authentically, free from fear and persecution.